I must clarify, this didn't happen only to me, but my uncle too. This was after Christmas Eve party when everyone went home. I decided to stay because my cousin and I were watching a movie. My uncle, who used to walk his dogs into the woods next to a park, went off to take them out. Before this, my aunt told him not to do that because it was way too dark out there. It was around 4 or 5 in the morning. He didn't care much and he went off anyways. My aunt was still worried, so I went along with him. Once there, nothing wrong seemed to happen. Everything was quiet. My uncle and his dogs were having a relaxing walk, as usual, and I wasn't really paying attention to the surroundings, when suddenly the dogs went still. This wasn't that strange. They always stopped to stare and bark at other animals they noticed, like rats, birds, insects, or other dogs. However, this time was different. When the dogs went still, my uncle and I noticed something was going wrong. The dog wasn't angry or curious, they were kind of nervous, anxious, or afraid. One of the dogs, the largest one, was growling and shaking. As my uncle started to get worried about the situation, we heard it. People in the woods. We didn't see how many because of the darkness, but they were saying something like this. "We all gather here by the blood of incomprehensible. We incomprehensible thee and thy incomprehensible." As my uncle and I heard that, he yelled for his dogs to follow him out of the woods. As we all left, he turned his head back and he only saw slight movement of branches and shrubs, perhaps because these people were trying to hide. After all that, he hasn't walked his dogs near to those woods, nor when it gets dark either. So, to the strangers in the woods, let's not meet. Couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd write out this experience I had a while back. Someone I loved very much passed away 4 years ago, and I was devastated over their death. The graveyard he's in is beautiful and it became my spot. Before he died, we actually used to walk his dog there together. I would visit his grave for hours sometimes and read, listen to music, walk around, etc. I would go at night a lot after I got off second shift around midnight as well. One night, I was really upset about something and wanted to visit him, and I pulled in and drove over to his site, but something felt off. I got out of the car and immediately wanted to get back in. I have a really good intuition and tend to always listen to my gut, which has never lied to me. I drove back out, but you have to go all the way around the cemetery to get back to the entrance. As I got to the top of the hill before the gate, which is still pretty far in, I see a person walking super fast, like almost speed walking towards my car. I jumped a mile. I looked closer, and an older woman was walking directly towards my car very fast, and had a gigantic smile on her face. After seeing that creepypasta video, The Smiling Man, it became one of my irrational fears. It was pretty chilly that night, and she looked like she was only wearing a long-sleeve shirt and pants. No parka or anything. The woman walked almost into my car, and then turned and walked off towards the woods on my right side. I drove further toward the gate and looked back, and she was literally walking straight into the woods. Now, at this point, it was like 1 a.m., and the cemetery is not a good neighborhood. It was bizarre. I drove out of there as fast as I could. I'm not sure if I'm in the right place, but I've held this story in for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy, and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere, absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, we went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back and had dinner. It was all very normal, until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and a stereo that we brought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and I felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces, laying next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now. It was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car door the night before and that an animal got into our stuff. I promised that I had locked it and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he had had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent holding his gun and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. The story I'm about to tell you happened yesterday night. I live in Nantes, West France. I'm quite a petite girl and I avoid confrontation whenever I can. I'm pretty good at it because since I can remember, I had a very strong sixth sense thing. I try to avoid people who make me anxious. It allowed me to survive some very dangerous situations and prevent one kidnapping, but that's not part of the story. Yesterday, I visited a very close friend of mine. A few days ago, she broke her leg, so I decided to cheer her up by giving her a few gifts. The atmosphere was so nice that I didn't notice when it got dark outside. Despite the late hour, I decided to go home. I said goodbye to my friend and left her apartment. I was about 40 minutes from home, but I walked this distance many times without any problems, so I thought it would be the same this time. Oh, how wrong I was. Less than 5 minutes passed, and I just felt like it was going to be hell. I was approaching one of the many bridges in our city. I didn't see anyone around. I thought my senses were playing a trick on me. This has happened before, so I kept going. The bridge was about 20 meters in front of me before I heard a conversation and giggling. I turned my head slightly and saw 3 men walking towards me. I felt a cold sweat on my back, but it was too late to turn back. I didn't want to show them that I was afraid because I know this type of behavior provokes more harassment. I kept walking but turned the music down. I didn't take my headphones off because I didn't want them to know about my suspicions. I heard their footsteps behind my back. They were saying something, but I didn't know what because they were speaking in a different language. I was already on the bridge when they caught up with me. As I said, I'm a petite girl. They were over 180 centimeters tall. They surrounded me. I had no choice but to go ahead. A shudder ran through my body. I didn't know what they wanted or what they were saying, but I felt like I was in danger. They kept talking to me. They leaned over me and whispered something into my ears, and then they laughed. The sound will haunt me for the rest of my life. At one point, they noticed I was doing my best to ignore them, and then the worst began. They started making animal noises. It may sound strange and maybe even funny, but it was terrifying to me. They howled, growled, whistled, and kissed the air loudly. They did these things very close to my face. I was desperate, but where would I go? I was on the bridge. I would kill myself if I jumped into the water, or at least break both my legs if I were lucky. Those 2 minutes to cross the bridge felt like an eternity for me. When we got to the end of the bridge, I was sweaty and close to tears. I thought I was going to throw up. I was shaking, which seemed to amuse them even more. And then a miracle happened. Someone called my name, very loud. I looked up and saw someone approaching us. He was a very tall man, several years older than me, but I didn't know him. I had no idea who he was or how he knew my name, but it didn't matter at the time. I felt he was my guardian angel. He came over to us and was staring furiously at the three strangers. I didn't see their faces, but they fell silent. "What are you doing to my girlfriend?" he asked, still frowning at them. He stretched out his hand in my direction, never taking his eyes off of them. "Come on, sweetheart." I did not wait. I didn't know who he was or why he was helping me, but I didn't care. I gripped his hand tightly and almost nestled against his shoulder. My heart was beating fast and loud, but I was so thankful that he came to help me. These three strangers and my savior exchanged glances. They were silent. I was starting to panic that they would attack him because he was there alone, and I wouldn't have the strength to help him if they would attack. But it didn't happen. I almost heard their teeth grinding when he muttered something. My savior held my hand tightly and watched them. They turned back and went back on the bridge. We stood in the same place for some time. He looked at me and then smiled, and at that moment my body gave up. I started shaking uncontrollably and I almost drowned in my own tears. He didn't say a word. He just held my hand and gave me time to cool down. After a long moment, he offered to take me home. We walked slowly and talked about various things. Actually, he was talking all the time. I was just nodding. I found out he was walking near the bridge and noticed the whole scene. He decided to react and help me if it turned out his assumptions were correct. I asked him how he knew me and how he knew my name. He looked surprised, then smiled and said he didn't know my name. He used this name because it's one of the most popular in our country. When we got home, I was still shaky but happy. I offered him something to drink. I don't live alone, so I wasn't worried about letting him in. But he kindly declined and we said goodbye. I can't believe how lucky I was yesterday. If I hadn't met him, I don't know if I could write about it today. So, Luke, thank you. Thank you so much for saving me. I hope to meet you one day. As to those three strangers, I hope one day you'll understand that your behavior is reprehensible and you'll change your attitude to women who walk alone. And I hope to never meet you again. This was a couple years ago when I was still walking in the early mornings. I would walk in the early morning because it felt so good to be alone, walking and just being alone with your thoughts. This particular day, I got up earlier than usual and decided to walk to the park. 20-minute walk to the park from my house. Well, before you get to the park, there's a four-way stop. Just before I got to the four-way stop, I noticed something very strange. A man in a top hat was walking very weirdly. He was taking these very unnecessary long steps, and he had his hands on his, I think, suspenders and leaning back. I was creeped out by this, and I thought of heading back home. As I started to turn, I noticed he did too. Then I started walking more quickly. I looked back and saw the man walking the same way, but faster. I started to panic and started to run. Well, he did too. Then, out of sheer luck, a cop car had passed me and stopped. The officer got out of the car and asked me why I was running. I told him that a weird guy in a top hat was chasing me. He looked behind him, but the guy wasn't there anymore. The cop then gave me a warning for lying, but I told him I wasn't. Then he said whatever and got in his car and drove off. I still ran back home, just in case the guy hid and tried to follow me again. I looked out the window, but nothing. Nobody was following me. I think if that cop hadn't stopped me, I wouldn't be alive to this day. One of the weirdest and scariest encounters I've ever had. Okay, so very weird experience my ex-girlfriend and I had back in 04-05 in rural Louisiana. That's somewhat relevant. We were hanging out at her parents' house on a summer night watching movies. Nothing out of the ordinary. We were around 16 or 17 at the time, so when 12:30, 1 a.m. rolled around, it was time for me to head home. I didn't have a vehicle at this point, so she usually dropped me off. Keep in mind, this is a rural area of Louisiana, and we lived on complete opposite sides of town. At this time of night, there were hardly any cars on the road, and it was rather spooky driving through the wooded areas to get to my place, which was secluded to say the least. We're about halfway to our destination, and in mid-conversation she stops talking and asks me if I had noticed the headlights that had been behind us for quite some time. I replied no, that I hadn't noticed, but assured her there was nothing to worry about. We continue our conversation, but now I'm really paying attention to the headlights behind us, and I notice they're getting closer. To get to my house, there were a lot of turns down roads that weren't main roads, and these headlights were staying with us. At this point, panic starts to set in for both of us as we try to come up with like a worst-case scenario plan. I thought of just pulling into the first driveway, but then thought, well, what if no one's home? And would they even help us at this time of night? Scratch that idea. I had an old flip phone at the time, and decided the best course of action was to call my house phone and hope that my dad would answer. Between that point and us turning down my dead-end road, I probably called 8 to 10 times with no answer. With the headlights still following us at every turn, I told my girlfriend to just pull into my driveway and lay on the horn. We pull in and do just that. The other vehicle pulls in right behind us. No one is coming out of my house, so she decides to cut across my front yard to try and get back to the road. I'm still calling my dad. As we go to turn around, the other car cuts us off, and that's when I got a good look at the man. Probably 50 to 60 years old, large rimmed glasses and smoking a cigarette. Our eyes meet, and he gave me the weirdest, creepiest grin, and that's when I had made my mind that I was just going to have to get out and confront the man. Right as I was building up the courage to do so, my dad ran out of the front door and the man in the car sped away. Needless to say, we didn't get very much sleep that night. She stayed at my place and we reported the incident with the best description we could give, but to no avail. This happened recently and I don't know what to make of this. I'm not sure if this belongs here, but here it goes. So I'm 21 female, not really an artsy person, but I do appreciate, like many, the beauty of nature and try to do my best to capture it from behind a lens. I grew up in a major city and the night sky hasn't always been visible, so moving to a smaller city for school has had its perks. My sister, 19 female, let's call her Ella, also came to my school and we're very close, so we do a lot of things together, including live together. This is sort of important for the backstory. I had a small get-together to attend to celebrate a friend's birthday, and I drove home pretty late, maybe 2:30 or so in the morning. On the way home, the road was empty and scarcely lit, but the moon was a beautiful crescent and I was really admiring the view. As I was pulling into the parking lot of my house, I called Ella. Both of us normally stay up pretty late because lots of schoolwork, and asked her if she wanted to come down and go look at the night sky and maybe do some night photography. She said yes, and she got in the car and I started driving. We live in a suburban sort of area, surrounded by lots of wooded areas, and I turned onto a back road instead of the main one. I asked Ella if she wanted to stop to take photos, and she said yes. There was a large parking lot that we spotted as we drove by for a bunch of department stores, and of course, since the department stores weren't open at night, it was empty. I knew that it's sketchy at night, but at Ella's insistence, and seeing that the sign said no deliveries between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m., I turned in. I park and she's taking some photos for her social media, trying to take pics through the windshield, but it was dirty, so she gets out. I'm still in the car, engine running, all doors are locked except hers. She knows not to stray too far away from the car because it's night, but then she came up to my window and told me to come out and take pictures because there was literally no one there. I was a little reluctant because what if something happened and we needed to leave right away? So I said no initially, but at her insistence, 5 minutes of her trying to convince me to come out, I got out of the car and locked it. She turned her camera towards me, so I walked maybe 15 to 20 feet away from the car, facing the road we just drove in from. I was posing for her and she was taking a 360-degree video. We must have been doing this for maybe a minute and I was on high alert, watching the road and watching my surroundings. I see this white van with tinted windows drive on the same road we drove in from, and I'm praying it won't turn in, but it's slowing. Knowing that there were supposed to be no deliveries at that time of night, I didn't have a good feeling. Being on high alert, I booked it towards my car. As I passed my sister on the way to the car, I said, "Ella, get in the car." She was also watching the road, and hearing the urgency in my voice, she ran to the other side and got in. I start the car and am putting on my seatbelt after locking the doors. Ella tells me to please hurry up. I'm watching as the van is in the lot now, stopped where we were literally less than a minute before. The entire van is tinted, so I can't see in, even with my high beam lights on. I can't see who's driving, and I can't see who else is in the car. I didn't even think to get the license plate, I just turned and booked it. Instead of going out the way we came from, I drove past the entirety of all the department stores, as close as I could get because of the cameras. Because if anything happened, at least there'd be a record of us being there. Here's the low-key terrifying part. I drive out of the main exit. The entire time I'm driving, I'm watching out of my rear and side view mirrors. Whoever was in that van didn't do anything else. They just turned their vehicle back around and onto the road that they had pulled in from, turning the way they had just driven from. I didn't go home right away, although my apartment was less than 5 minutes away. I went and drove around for almost an hour around my college town, around the city. Took so many different routes, because I wasn't sure if it was them tailing us. I think I lost the van around half an hour later, but just to be safe, I drove around for a little longer, taking a different route home. Nothing ended up happening to me, but be careful out there. It felt so surreal, like a horror movie. Ella and I avoided potentially getting into a horrible situation, possibly even life-threatening, mostly by getting lucky. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. The adrenaline, plus knowing that we avoided a situation in which we could have been hurt, really plagued me. I was terrified, but I think I handled it pretty well. Had my car stalled or something, I'm not sure what would have happened. When I was about 16, 9 years ago, my family was living in a suburban area outside of LA. It was a nice neighborhood. Kids rode their bikes in a group, parents waved to each other and helped keep an eye on people's houses. You could join a barbecue if you walked by at the right time. Well, my dad was working nights at a hospital in the city that left myself, female 16, my mom, female 36, my sister 12, and my brother 8 home at night from 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. the next day. One night, we're cooking, listening to music, and just all around having a good night, and everyone's in bed by 9. I'm woken up to the sound of our front door being rattled, and my mom calling for my dad like he's home. Our house was laid out like this. There's a front door and a small entryway, and the right side wall, facing the door from the outside, was my brother's room. Myself and my sister were on the other side of him, and the doorway leading into our dining room. My mom's room was off the living room towards the back of the house, so she typically turned on lights to come by our room. It wasn't all that uncommon for my dad to get let off of shift a few hours early and end up home before 7. My front door was frosted glass in the middle that was clear enough we could see whoever was at the door. It was old and a little off, so typically you had to put a little force into opening the door, even if it's unlocked. This next part my mom filled in. She had gotten up, also hearing the door, and thought that my dad was home just as I had. However, upon calling out for my dad to confirm and turning on the light switch, whoever it was at the door froze and noticeably jumped. She had still been walking closer to the door to open it to help him, still half asleep, when she realized the man in the doorway was as tall as my dad, but had a full head of hair as well as his outline not matching the familiar outline of my dad coming home in scrubs. This man was wider than my dad, and once he could see my mom in the doorway, he started not only turning the knob, but throwing himself up against the frosted glass. And now, back to what I know. I don't know what kept me from rolling over and going back to bed, but in the next few seconds I heard my mom scream and sat up in time to hear her footsteps, and then see her as she disappeared into her bedroom, to come back out with a revolver my dad had bought her for her birthday. At this point I had rolled over and checked my cell phone quickly to see it was 1:30 in the morning and had dialed 911, while my mom was pointing the gun at whoever was at the door, trying to force their way inside. "Stop or I'll shoot you. I'm on the phone with the police and they're on their way. I will use force if you enter my home." My mom was screaming it at the huge man at the door who, after hearing her the second and third time, finally stepped back from the door and was just staring at our shapes from the other side of the frosted glass. After a moment's thought, he seemed to like his chances because he had stepped forward again and only ran once my mom pulled the pin back and repeated what she had been saying, adding that she might decide not to even wait for him to be inside. He ran off, as I mentioned, and I stayed on the phone with 911 as my mom stood at the doorway, her gun still in both her hands aimed at the door the way my dad had taught her to hold it just the weekend before when we had all gone to the range. It was only a moment after the man had fled that 2 uniformed officers filled the doorway the man had just been in, and when they knocked, I realized, after she didn't respond to them identifying themselves, how terrified my mother was. Her voice shook as she told the officers that she had a weapon, but that she wanted to hear their badge numbers before she would open the door so I could confirm with the dispatcher. Once they did, she opened the revolver and unloaded it, putting it on the table and crying as I opened the door for the police. They took our statements, had several patrol cars out looking, and found him a few hours later 6 blocks from our home. However, he had made it into the residence he was trying to break into, and they caught him in the middle of robbing the retired couple he had knocked unconscious. So, home invader, let's not meet. These creepy events took place at a local hiking trail I wasn't too fond of. I won't name the trail itself for privacy reasons. I will say it was here in Southern Cali. I went with 2 friends. For the sake of their privacy, their names for the story will be Jaslyn and Vivian. This trail is a 40-minute drive away from our hometown. This was unplanned like most of our hikes and destinations. We arrived approximately at 6 p.m. We were all aware that by the time we finished up the trail, it would be dark. We have been walking for about 20 minutes, and this guy with a pretty large stick passes by and tells us to be very careful because of snakes being present. And just by the look on his face, he looked pretty petrified. I normally run into rattlesnakes on hikes, and yes, they tend to be scary looking, but just give them their space and they'll leave. I didn't acknowledge much of what he said. He hands me the stick he was holding and I give it to Jaslyn. Normally I would throw it away, but for some reason I told Jaslyn to keep it. It was weird for me to tell her so, but I ignored the weird thoughts I was getting. After walking for an additional 10 minutes, we run into this couple, and normally we greet people on the way up and downhill. The couple asked us if we had flashlights, and we replied with yes. That's when I asked them how far away we were from the springs. The man said it was about another 25 minutes away. We part ways from them and proceed to walk. At this point, the sun is finally set and it's beginning to get dark. Jaslyn brought her taser, a lighter, and hairspray. Vivian brought her flashlight. We had a pretty decent view thanks to the light provided. This is when things begin to go south. We're literally only 5 minutes away from reaching the springs. As soon as we step 1 foot closer, an adult rattlesnake almost falls on Jaslyn's head. It slithers away pretty fast. Strangely enough, the entire environment started to feel ominous. Jaslyn and Vivi were also feeling the same way. I'm usually the friend who perennially likes to brush off any thought of fear or negativity. I don't automatically like to jump to conclusions. Jaslyn gets a little frightened when anything scary happens. Yes, that includes running into animals like snakes. As far as I know, Vivi hasn't really experienced anything terrifying or just an event in particular that makes one genuinely feel fear. It is completely dark by now and we decide to head back. To give a better idea on how steep it was going downhill, it was dangerous to the point where one wrong step can make you fall off the cliff or slip and get badly injured. Even trying to run is really a big risk. The paths are very narrow. We had to walk behind each other. Fast forward 10 minutes. Since we've been walking and we reach one part of the trail that is the steepest. Naturally, I'm used to power walking fast, going along with the flow. Vivi was pacing herself, going a little slow, and Jaslyn stayed in the middle. I start moving the taser's mini flashlight and see a blurry figure standing in the corner of the trail. I begin to slow down, but I was going too fast. I had stopped right in front of it. This is when I noticed Jaslyn and Vivi were left a little behind. I moved the flashlight up towards the figure's face, and it revealed this putrid-looking guy. It looked like he hasn't showered in months. "Oh shit, you scared the hell out of me," I said in sarcasm, hoping to get a greeting back from this man. Nothing, no response. He stares at me with this deranged blank expression. At this time, he really made me feel unsettled. He looked high on something, and I know for a fact it was not weed. Jaslyn and Vivi get closer, and that's when I hear Vivi jokingly say, "I'm surprised you didn't tase him." Even after hearing this, still no response from the man. This is when I begin to look at him from head to toe, just to see if he has a weapon of some sort. The entire time, he had one hand in his pants and the other outside. This is when I noticed he was wearing black gloves. To give a brief description on how the man looked, he had long greasy hair, really dirty pants with bleach stains all over, a really big oversized hoodie, and a ripped beanie. To top it off, he also had no flashlight. It was at least 8:30 p.m. There's just no way he could see and walk around in the dark with no light, especially since this trail is almost impossible to walk around at night. Every red flag possible started going off in my head. My unsettling feeling starts to rise. I'm pretty sure at this point the man can see fear all over my face. This is when Jaslyn tells me something in Spanish, which in English pretty much means, "At this point, I'm not scared of the snakes. I'm more afraid of the man." I told her to stay quiet and to turn off the music. And this is when Jaslyn and I began to run. I didn't really notice that Vivi was left behind. I kept running. I was too scared to process the eerie encounter. Vivi gets a little freaked out, and Jaslyn and I had to calm her down. I started to lose a little bit of my patience when she wanted to stop and stand for a few minutes. She was just in complete denial and refused to believe that the guy was any threat. I couldn't bear standing around, so I began to walk. Luckily, Jaslyn managed to convince Vivi to move forward. The rest of the hike was okay, besides the occasional slipping and tripping. Once we got back to the car, we all said it. He gave me serious serial killer vibes. After that incident, I can now say, never will I return there at night.